So Brian, thank you so much for coming here to National Defense University today, and especially being on the National Defense NATDEF podcast show. Welcome again, and we'll go ahead and get started. If you could just share a little bit about yourself.
Got it. 20 years and 10 minutes. Got it. Originally went to college for criminal justice, got out eventually. That path led me to the military. I ended up spending 8 years working active duty military intelligence for the United States Army, 4 years of doing human intelligence, 4 years as a counterintelligence special agent. Got out, spent about 5 to 6 years working as a contractor, various DoD agencies, DIA, NRO, DCSA, all those fun groups that people will be like, what are those? Finally ended up with DTRA, a Defense Threat Reduction Agency out of Fort Belvoir. Worked for them for 3 years as a contractor. Eventually went federal, spent another 3 years there, and then eventually came to CBP's Office of Intelligence. I now work as the branch chief for the CI branch of the Insider Threat and Counterintelligence Support Division of CBP's Office of Intelligence.
And for those who might not know, where is CBP located?
Sure. So I'm currently located at the Ronald Reagan Building, but obviously CBP has basically the broad structure of OI in particular. We maintain 8 regional intelligence centers, and then we have our 2 border intelligence centers that kind of feed back to headquarters. Most of us, we obviously have CBP officers all along both borders, most ports, airport locations, very much co-located with the TSA. I'm sure folks have seen folks when they've traveled, particularly internationally, you go through customs, all that kind of good stuff.
Thank you for sharing that. So over the past 15 years, what are some key changes that you may have seen occur in the IC?
Sure. So I think for me, just kind of getting back in a little bit of history, I joined the Army in 2006. This was the height of the surge. This was the height of both wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So obviously counterterrorism was at the forefront of the IC's mind at all times. It was very much a tactically focused operation. It was mainly you're collecting intel for the purpose of rolling up a target. You were collecting intel for the purpose of taking out a target, finding an IED cell, finding an IED cache, whatever it is. So not only was it more focused in the moment, but it was very tactically focused as well. And I think that's another reason why you look at things like the National Joint Counterterrorism Task Force got a lot more attention, a lot of the money, kind of that focus, because at the time, most of the sentiment in America and the IC was counterterrorism is the main threat we have to deal with. Particularly at this point, it was Islamic extreme fundamentalism, and that was kind of a global concern and a threat. We looked at it expanding into places like Africa with groups like Boko Haram, as well as ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all of those groups. So that was the original focus. That's where we were at that point. Now, kind of transitioning over the next maybe about 5 to 6 years, we see us leaving Iraq, a severe drawdown in Afghanistan. We're seeing those local security groups kind of taking the reins and us kind of pulling back. Well, this kind of takes away the focus of your kind of tactical counterterrorism focus within the IC. Now you're kind of drawing back to more of instead of a kinetic small scale mission, you're now going back to kind of a larger intel picture for kind of the global setting. So I think one of the biggest changes we've seen is a major kind of shift away from counterterrorism tactical to near peer global competition counterintelligence kind of setting up now. We're also starting to see, I think another thing that should be mentioned is there's a major change for really since the end of World War II up until I would say particularly after the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States was unchallenged in the world as far as dominant foreign policy goes. That's no longer the case anymore. We obviously have seen the emergence of the BRICS Union, which whether or not it's completely functional as it is, it certainly shows that there is another force trying to influence operations in places like South America and Africa in particular. We've seen this with China with the Belt and Road Initiative. We've seen this with kind of the BRICS alliance. There is clearly a diplomatic competition that we haven't seen maybe in the last 7 or 8 years now is starting to really kind of assert itself. And places where we would have enjoyed a certain level of influence kind of without really a dearth of competition, we now have. What that changes for the IC is that the IC has to look at it. Not only do we have to look at it from collection from a strategic standpoint, which is inherently going to be more long-range focused and long-term focused, but we're going to have to utilize every avenue we can of intel collection, whether this means leaning on the diplomatic corps, whether this means ensuring that we have a good relationship with academia, not just places like the NDU, but also private academia as well. Do we have a good relationship with our cleared contractors as well as our manufacturing centers to make sure that our innovations and our competitive edges are not being lost to overseas espionage and things like that? So it's really been a kind of a major, really an expansion of scope is the first one. We've gone away from that tactical kind of setting to more of a global competition setting. And then also the different avenues through which we collect intelligence and we also have to safeguard our intelligence have also drastically expanded as well. It's not that these things weren't a focus before, it's just they were kind of, I don't want to say fallen out of fashion, but they'd fallen out of focus. And a lot of them have really come into focus in the last maybe 5-6 years.
If I could just follow up on the refocus that you're describing, how did that change affect your I guess analysts? Because I would imagine that if I'm a counterterrorism specialist or I'm a Middle Eastern specialist, and now the scope is wider. You've got a lot of people who are maybe used to have probably a lot of people focused on the Middle East, a lot of people who are focused on counterterrorism. Now suddenly without
without a mission, really.
A mission, right?
Yeah.
So how did that shift change the personnel and environment, I guess?
Well, I guess the old adage is nothing in the government turns quickly. So obviously it's very similar to, I remember when I was going through interrogator school, they were just finished teaching the Russian scenario for interrogation. They had just moved on to the Middle East scenario. So obviously all the groups in the classes before me, keep in mind, we'd already been in Iraq in 3 years by this point and been in Afghanistan for 5 at this point. So those guys were still getting the Russian scenario, and then they were showing up in the Middle East or Southwest Asia. That's probably not going to be so helpful. So what the military did and what most the IC has to do is you rely on the folks that are there on the ground doing what the work that they are doing. So there is a transitional period that does happen. It can cause growing pains because you definitely have folks missing that. A great example of this is JIDO, which was one of the agencies that was predominantly for the counterterrorism focus. Kind of found itself without a mission and was trying to find different agencies to work with and different ways to support itself. It is difficult and it is not something that happens very quickly. I would say that the good news for them, and I wouldn't say it's good news for the world, but it's good news for them, is that counterterrorism didn't really go away. It's just, it became more of a local or regional concern for most places. People were more focused on, okay, what is a threat to my country, my region at the moment, as opposed to the United States was kind of doing the global war on terror. So those guys still had a mission, and certainly they had a mission coordinating with a lot of these host nation governments conducting anti-terrorism. But at the same time, the good thing with intel analysts is they don't necessarily start with that discipline. They didn't go into being intel an analyst just to be a counterterrorism analyst. And a lot of those same functions, the ICD 203 and 206 standards, the basics of intelligence analysis, those don't change, which is good. So even though they had to do a refocus, it didn't suddenly take their previous training and completely discount it. Now what they did have to do, and I think this is what many people in the IC have had to do, is we had to get smart on a whole lot of topics we weren't smart on before. Most of us, when we were focused on strictly kind of kinetic operations, you were focused on the kinetic capabilities of a cell, how it structures, who the leader is, what their particular attack methodologies are. Now, when you go into kind of the global strategic world, now you have to take into account, diplomatic pressures, global alliances, economic facets. It's a completely different way of thinking and a different way of focusing.
And if I can interject right there, what are some ways that you saw them trying to get smart on those topics in an efficient way for different agencies?
I mean, the DoD was very big on kind of pushing a lot of this stuff. A great example of this is most people know JCTA, Joint Counterintelligence Training Academy, has been great about doing country scenarios and country seminars on Russia, Iran, China as well, so things like that. So kind of the first thing was getting the threat information, and I think that was handled pretty well. But you also saw a lot more of kind of a refocus on education. I saw that as well when guys would come back from deployments. A lot more educational opportunities were available. I know CBP, they have an entire intelligence enterprise training academy now that's been set up for not only intelligence fundamentals, but systems exploitation and understanding, those different facets. So I think the big thing is a lot of agencies got really smart that they would have to probably train their intel personnel for the mission that they were conducting. Whereas before they had maybe gotten away with the fact that, as long as they were trained on the threat set, we didn't necessarily have to do too much. Now it's like, okay, we've got to train each person to our individual standards or our individual mission to make sure we're getting the most effect out of our people that we can.
Yeah. Oh, of course. The refocus, maybe you'd like to get into the current regional conflicts with respect to the Middle East and
Sure.
and Europe. You have a lot of things that has transpired between 2022 with the invasion of Ukraine and now, of course, with the Hamas and Israel war. So, how has that affected the focus there with respect to the IC, and then kind of what kind of considerations have been kind of baked into U.S. national security writ large?
Sure. So, we'll start with Russia first, since it was the first one of these. First off, I don't know how many people were expecting conventional war to make the comeback it did, which is essentially now. When I say conventional war, just for folks to clarify, I'm talking about force on force, guys wearing uniforms going bang bang at each other, right? Which is not the war we've been fighting for the last 15, 20 years, which has mainly been terrorist cells hiding within local populations, essentially, taking advantage of that cover. So this was different. This was going to be a different war. Now, the challenge in this one is there were certain longstanding agreements that we were put in a difficult bind with. I think most people are familiar with the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which essentially was Ukraine will denuclearize, but in return, if they are invaded by either the U.S. or the Russians, as if us invading the U.S. was going to be a thing, the other would defend them. So Russia now essentially violates the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, puts the U.S. in a difficult spot. Russia's claim is what? That, Ukraine was considering joining NATO and this was an encroachment and things like that. So all of those kind of factors put us in a weird position diplomatically. Conventional warfare-wise, it is interesting what we've learned. The Patriot is still the king of air defense. Right. If there was ever a thing to learn, that's a lot of what it is. But I think a lot of people would have expected the overall push to end, and it kind of has devolved into a war of attrition, almost a borderline World War I style, where there's very small pushes in each direction. And I think it becomes now a situation of Russia seems to be betting on the idea that eventually global support for Ukraine will wane, and obviously they're hoping that lasts until their own resolve kind of falters. So that's already kind of a weird situation. For CBP in particular, one of the things that we're concerned with is we've seen a lot of refugee movement in like Eastern Europe, for example, and that starts to cause a concern of countries like Poland or Romania and other places are starting to see, how easy is it for Russia to probably slip IOs into those migrant groups when they come across to maybe conduct intel operations or maybe even infiltrate back into Ukraine, different ways like that. So that's one aspect of it. Obviously, the elephant in the room is you're talking about a nuclear power who is engaged in a conventional war that, I'm not saying they would. There's a variety of things that would probably have to happen, but you can't completely discount that possibility, and that's something that has to be addressed. And also, their intel collection has ramped up drastically. Not only are they interested in collecting as much information on, our policies, but very much a focus on Eastern Europe for them as well. So countries that maybe weren't traditionally involved in this kind of conflicts, again, places like Poland, and then obviously the Baltic nations have always had a concern with being right on Russia's doorstep. What does this impact for them? So there's a lot of follow-on concerns and trepidation that also kind of come into this conflict. It's really not just a war between two countries. It's a question of ideology, and also what is the off-ramp? right? What does the off-ramp look like? Obviously, Ukraine will not accept anything except complete Russian withdrawal, and Russia is obviously not interested in doing that as well. So do we have to find a diplomatic solution? Does that diplomatic solution involve Ukraine losing territory? What does that mean to our global standing on the world? What does it also mean to our... Is anybody going to take a memorandum we signed seriously ever again if we weren't able to enforce it again? I understand it's been, it had been, 18 plus 24 years since, but the point was that memorandum was still in standing. So how do we go from there? So a lot of questions, not a lot of answers. This is still a relatively new conflict. It will be, and I hate to say it like this because I know there's people over there that are losing their lives, but it will be something that'll have to be studied as we continue going forward, because I don't know if there's any hard and fast answers on it. With and not only with Gaza and Israel, but can't forget the Houthis in Yemen. It's interesting because both of those have influence in kind of different ways. With Gaza and Israel, I think people are looking at this, and what's been interesting about this has been the reaction on a lot of different sides. I think personally speaking, and again, this is me strictly speaking on my own, the fact that a two-state solution was never forced down, and probably should have at some point, is probably what led to this. And the reason I say that is because the Palestinian Authority and Hamas do not seem particularly interested in a two-state solution, because it would still enable Israel to exist, which does not seem to be in their interest. If they do a two-state solution and then they attack Israel, it's no longer a terrorist act; it's an act of war. That's a huge difference and change. So I think the only real way to actually fix it, I think you would have to get the nations of the world, UN, to come down and say, okay, we're setting borders. This will be the two states as they live from now on, and any other further movement has to be treated as an act of war. You would almost, it's the only way you could really kind of set this up. But even still, I mean, when you have a nation that essentially, you have an area like Gaza that essentially elected a terrorist organization as its government, the concern starts to become, if this can happen here, could it happen other places? What does that mean for, global national security? What does it mean for our own security? Right? These kind of situations. The election of governments in places like South America that also maybe would have these kind of mantras or mindsets. Colombia in particular has, I believe they've removed their Israeli embassy and, will not recognize the country. These kind of concerns, obviously, and it's no secret they're our biggest ally in the West. It's no secret that they're one of our biggest allies in the entire region, and they do align the most with our values. So how do we support them, but at the same time recognize that we want to support the other nations in the Middle East? Because people seem to forget, and people won't necessarily want to hear this, but I really do think that the October 7th attack was actually predicated on the reaffirming of the Abraham Accords. And I think Iran, personally, this is my personal opinion, Iran does not like the idea of the Abraham Accords because it essentially galvanizes the Sunni Arab republics against them, right? It puts these guys into an alliance with Israel that says, okay, you guys can stand on your own against Iran, and we don't have to be involved, which is a win-win for everybody, because if 25 years in the sandbox have taught us anything, it's that we're just not very good there. We're just not that good at it. So that happens. Iran takes advantage of their relationship with Hamas and says, cause this disruption, create a new conflict in the Middle East. And now, the Abraham Accords, you force Jordan into a very difficult position because they obviously want to support Palestine, but they also were signing this agreement with Israel. It puts us in a bad relationship with Saudi Arabia. It pushes them closer to like Russia and things like that. I know that was in the news, Biden going over there. That was kind of a challenge. So there's a lot of geopolitical fallout that comes from this one. It's probably, of the three conflicts, it's the most politically charged. And it's caused a lot of strong reactions on a lot of different sides. I think this is what happens when you don't concretely set borders and you leave a situation kind of in geopolitical limbo for too long. You will eventually give somebody the ability to be disruptive.
Even if there is a two-state solution, will war then be still inevitable, or will it still occur? Will there continue attacks even with a two-state solution? So the one argument is, even with a two-state solution, attacks will continue. So what is the point of a two-state solution if the behavior will not change? And looking at what happened in Ukraine, or the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the way the West reacted, will the West react the same or enhance efforts to help protect Israel's sovereignty? with the borders that they do have.
So this is the example I used. If France and if a political group in Spain crossed the border into France and murdered 1,700 people, would we hold the government of Spain responsible? On some level, we absolutely would, right? Because it's a political group that has representation in their government. I kind of look at it the same way. Hamas is very smart in that they have taken advantage of the fact that while they are the elected government of this area, they still get to act as a terrorist organization. It's kind of the same game that Hezbollah plays in Lebanon, right? Where they have a political branch and then they have the branch that does all the terrible things, kind of situation. Forcing the statehood, in my opinion, would enable it to at least change the terminology. It doesn't get to be a terrorist attack anymore. Now it's an act of war, which means that when Israel responds, that response can be proportional as an act of war, right? They don't have to be, looking at it of, oh, well, it was only a terror. Like, no, you still came across the border and you murdered, 1,700 people. It does not change that. So that, I'm not necessarily saying the two-state solution will solve every problem, because it would not. I don't think anybody's debating that. And you are going to have people that are going to disagree about how this land is handled for the majority of time. But I think if, and this is the thing is, the people who have rejected the two-state solution have not been Israel. Israel's the one who's made the proposals multiple times. It's been the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, and it's because they believe in their heart of hearts that from the river to the sea is what they want. Obviously, that's not going to happen. So rather than continuing to allow them to utilize this idea of, oh, you're encroaching on our land, kind of situation, establish borders now, and that way they don't get the chance to use that anymore as a pretense for violence. And again, I don't know if that's the perfect solution. I'm certainly not a diplomatic major, but I look at that conflict, and that's really the only way I can see it being somewhat stabilized in that regard.
I wanted to see if you can kind of walk us through, kind of your perspective on these information campaigns, if I have this right.
Absolutely.
With respect to both kind of like the initial phase of the Russian invasion and kind of the response from President Zelensky, which was very much a inspirational video he did with his staff, cabinet, rather. Sorry.
Yes.
From there, drawing a through line to some of the efforts from those who are in the Middle East, particularly supporters of Hamas, influencing those on our college campuses. So just want to see if you can kind of give us your perspective and talk through that.
It's such a huge aspect now. Is informational warfare is probably the number. It's probably the most rapidly growing aspect of the IC that the IC has to deal with. PsyOps campaigns and misinformation is probably the number one danger when it comes to the public, because it creates such a malign influence. Now, that's not me trying to sit here and say the public is stupid. It's not that. But if they're bombarded with a certain message over a while in lieu of any kind of countervailing information, you can only believe what you're told. Once it's been bombarded in your head, it's kind of there. So Russia, obviously, what was their original kind of justification for? Well, it's a special military operation to deal with neo-Nazi elements in the Donetsk, Luhansk provinces, or in the Donbass region. Okay, well, like all great lies, there's a hint of truth, right? The Azov battalions and those kind of units are there, and they do have some troubling, concerns with that. But shouldn't that be something that's left up to that sovereign nation to handle? I don't really necessarily see why you need to come across and handle that. Right. But obviously in their in their mind, they can use that as their pretense for doing it. So I can admire the cleverness, but it's about as subtle as a sledgehammer. The other thing is, this isn't the first time Russia's done disinformation. So for those that don't know, the Lugar Center is one of the is run by DHS, is a huge biosafety and security foundation. We do a lot of medical research, things like that. If you were to believe Russian propaganda, apparently that thing is responsible for everything from spreading COVID to infecting people with hepatitis, right? Because it's so much easier to blame any of these health failings on somebody else that it's very convenient for them. So the first kind of challenge is this a lie they're just using to deflect from something, or is this a lie that has a malicious agenda? Is the first kind of identification that has to be made. Then you also have to look at it as the misinformation that they push out, and then the disinformation that they push inward on their own people, right? Because they do both. So obviously they're going to misrepresent the they're going to misrepresent the conflict itself. One of my favorite YouTube channels, there's a guy named Habitual Line Crosser, and he basically, he's a guy who studied and taught the Patriot missile defense system. If you heard the Russians, apparently the Russians have blown up all of our Patriots, blah, 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 which is hilarious because they're all still right there just shooting up missiles, so don't know what you're talking about. But it's the same idea, right? You have to do that because otherwise everybody back home is going to go, you're not doing so well in this. And yeah, you've lost over 2,000 of your armored vehicles in 2 years. This is not good. So that's one aspect. But then they also have to, again, they have to convince their own public why they're doing what they're doing, right? So that's why, again, you have this idea of we're liberating, these guys from a fascist group and all this kind of stuff. And I don't know how effective it's been with the Russian people because we saw the protests in Moscow. I also think that Russia doesn't necessarily have to, hate to say it like this, but the advantage of being, essentially a totalitarian dictator is I don't think you have to care too much what your own people think. Right. And unfortunately, both him and Xi Jinping have taken advantage of that when it comes to messaging.
And if I could just chime in here in terms of messaging for anybody who might not be familiar with what the terms mean with disinformation and misinformation. So disinformation is false information that is intended to mislead.
Yes.
While misinformation is false information, but the intent isn't necessarily to mislead.
Yes, it's a degree of intent. So obviously, if somebody isn't, people say things, particularly online, say things that are wrong all the time, and there's nothing wrong with that because the intention was to be correct and informed. They're just misinformed. But if you're actively spreading, disinformation propaganda, that's obviously essentially an information warfare action, which is slightly different. And then when you, so that's that's happening on that, again, that nation to nation conventional warfare sphere where a lot of the propaganda or a lot of the disinformation is coming from governmental authorities. Now you transition that to, kind of almost going back in time to a regional terroristic conflict with Gaza and Israel. The misinformation and disinformation, a lot of times what I've seen is an intent to obfuscate, right? Mm-hmm. So just for an example, right, you'll see kids on college campuses chanting from the river to the sea, and you'll ask them what river and what sea, and they can't tell you. Or you'll ask them what's in Hamas's charter, and they don't know. Things, or you'll ask them about, Hamas's position on certain, LGBTQ rights, for example, and they don't know. So in their case, they've almost taken the opposite approach. Rather than trying to explain their actions, they're trying to keep as much of their kind of true nature as obfuscated as possible because they're taking advantage of, and by their own nature, they've called them useful idiots, right? They're taking advantage of people on campuses. But it's things like that. And I think some of it is, there is a sentiment that, are there people suffering in Gaza? Absolutely, nobody's questioning that. But pretending that Gaza was the victim in this scenario is obfuscating, again, the fact that, but you'll talk to some kids on college campus and they won't even believe that the October 7th attacks happened. Mm-hmm. It's somewhat telling that the October 7th attacks media coverage died very quickly, where the Israeli counterattack almost seemed to get more publicity. Now, whether or not that was just because of the news cycle or whether that was because of concerted efforts, that's a matter of interpretation. But that, because the Israeli, counterattack is still ongoing, right, it continues to get media coverage. So as the October 7th, which is essentially a one-off, fades further and further, you end up that. So sometimes it's not even pure disinformation from an intentional perspective, but it's just the nature of the nature of the news cycle is almost doing the work for them. So it's not always necessary. What's the old expression? Don't ever ascribe malice when stupidity might do. It's the same idea. Don't ever assume something's a concerted action when it just might be the result of natural, acting forces. With Yemen and the Houthis, it's kind of the other opposite, where the threat to international shipping, right, was something where, a lot of people will hear about Gaza and Palestine or Russia and Ukraine, and they're like, well, it doesn't really affect me. Well, pretty sure the Yemen issue affects anybody who's ever done international shipping of any kind, right? So if you buy anything off Amazon, you're suddenly now concerned because they need to get through that strait. So that's an interesting, and that one's been interesting because obviously we have our own concern with that, and obviously Saudi Arabia has a major concern with that as well, but not getting China's buy-in as much on this, or suddenly now they decide to not be involved in international politics. I was like, that's interesting. It's almost like you're hoping that international shipping will once again be more refocused towards you, but I'm sure that couldn't possibly be the intent behind this or anything. So yeah, in all three conflicts, there certainly is, and I think this will be the new way going forward, is informational warfare is likely going to, at this point, I could almost make the argument that there should be a subsection of OSINT involved around informational warfare and disinformation, misinformation. And I think a lot of people already treat it as such. So realistically, that is the next level of it. And I can only imagine how much that's going to continue to explode with the evolution of AI.
Right.
Once you can just generate propaganda at an AI's pace, the ability to separate, you're now going to have to almost employ AI to sort through misinformation and disinformation
Right.
from AI, which is, you want to talk about creating a tool that's just going to make your own life harder. But it's going to be that. And we're already seeing it now, obviously right now it's only being used by things, but like, putting celebrities' heads on other people's bodies, but deep fakes, right? Mm-hmm. Or we've seen, people can take a voice sample from somebody and completely set up a new recording of them saying something they never actually said. We have an election coming up this year, maybe not so much this one, but subsequent ones. How much does that have an impact? How much does that have an impact on the world, right? The ability to sort out open source truth will be the next great pursuit in the age of disinformation. And it's because it's cheap to do. It's very easy to pull off. I have a computer. I can create misinformation. It's very easy. And if I'm smart, I will create it in a way that doesn't look like I was trying to intentionally mislead anybody. Right? Obviously, propaganda will always have a place, but if I can get people believing the wrong thing by accident, that's just as effective. So, but yeah, informationally, they're all going to. These are all. If you're not thinking that every piece of the new warfare toolbox is going to have to, I mean, look, the Army's always had a PSYOP core. We've always had, like, this is nothing new, but this isn't going to be handing out pamphlets and winning hearts and minds anymore. This is going to be global information warfare operations done in real time via internet communications.
And to that point, China, their PLA, they actually did some restructuring recently, you may be aware of, with respect to their informational forces. So wanted to see, or hear your points or thoughts on, PRC as a global competitor and some of the things that they're doing in the information environment.
So, it's a very multi-layered position. The first I'll start
in 30
with,
seconds, though.
Yeah. Go quick now. So you've got the Made in China 2025 initiative, which was them basically saying we are going to try to acquire as much innovation as we can possibly do to reverse engineer it when we get home. So that has caused kind of a global economic espionage full court press on every piece of whether that is agricultural and biotechnology, whether that is hypersonics, quantum computing, whatever it is. Additionally, we've also seen them recruiting retired pilots, retired members of the military for training their operations. I'm trying to remember the name of I think it was a congressperson, but basically said, this is the equivalent of retired Army guys going to the Soviet Union and training them how to fly. Like, it's just probably not the best idea. But, the PRC is very smart. One of the ways they've really focused is academia, right? Academia, as I'm sure I don't have to tell to NDU folks, academia has usually a pretty open culture about sharing, working together, collaboration, publish or die kind of situation. Right. As such, right, it's very easy for the PRC to send out blast emails and come here for a workshop, come here for this, and maybe while you're here we can pick your brain on this stuff. Right, so they're very smart about taking advantage of some of the cultural differences to try to get as much information as they can. So that's one avenue. The other one is when it comes to their own manufacturing, trying to consolidate their supply chains as well as they can, ideally with the countries that they work best with. So again, I go back to the BRICS initiative. A lot of that I feel really comes from they've kind of gone around to all the countries that we either don't get along with, didn't get along with, or have had a falling out recently, and they said, hey, Belt and Road Initiative, how'd you like some money, right? And so it's a big investment in South America and Africa, right? Two nations that historically we have not focused as much. Great example in the news, Texhong Industries, which is a Chinese-owned subsidiary, invested $400 million into Honduran textiles. Now, do they do that just because they got a really big thing for Honduran textiles? Or is it maybe because Honduran textiles can be imported into the United States without going through the same tariffs that would normally go through? So again, taking advantage of those situations, they're very good about understanding we're trying to build relationships with South America just like they are, and they've taken advantage of that. So, hey, let's build infrastructure for you. Oh, and we don't really want much. We just want your fishing rights, or we just want this and that. It's interesting with the PRC because you can identify where their weaknesses are, and it kind of focuses on their collection. So agriculture is the big one that I think most people have identified, right? So pushing for fishing rights or trying to buy up farmland. There was a bust the FBI conducted a few years ago, I believe in 2015, 2016. A bunch of guys were trying to travel to the PRC with seeds. And people with seeds, then you got to figure places like Monsanto and other agricultural companies spend tens of millions of dollars bioengineering crop yields to increase yields, make them more effective. That same technology, if they can steal it and reverse engineer it, how much money do they save?
Right.
Very famously, we talk about the F-22 project that, unfortunately we started diving into the supply chain and whoopsie, turns out we're actually getting stuff from the PRC. Right. So it really does encompass kind of everything. SCRIM, supply chain risk management, is becoming a huge factor, and we've seen that with one of the things that COVID showed us was that, kind of these stovepipe supply chains was probably a bad idea because once there was economic disruptions in one country or even logistical disruptions, suddenly there was a problem. So we started to kind of diversify that. China learned that kind of same idea, and they've started to kind of consolidate their supply chains in certain ways. And then obviously the elephant in the room with China is that little island right next to them. They'd really like it to be part of theirs if they could, right? Now, I always wondered if the push for Taiwan is strictly ideological, because I don't necessarily think it is. I think if Taiwan did not produce anything of particular note, I don't know how much they would actually care. The fact that Taiwan is responsible for the largest portion of semiconductor production, I think has more of a factor than the ideological pitch. I really do think it's an economic thing, particularly with how desperate China is for having a supply chain for semiconductors that are effective. If they could somehow acquire TCSM, I believe is the name of the company, I mean, that would obviously make a huge thing. Obviously, it's not going to happen, but obviously the United States, again, in a way to diversify, have passed for that continuality. We passed the CHIPS Act, right? We've decided, okay, clearly we need to start making some of this domestically, maybe not all of it, but we certainly need to make some of it here, need to make some of it closer to here, diversify it so that if a place is shut down for whatever reason, or for example, let's say shipping out of the Middle East is disrupted, we have our options. So, and where that ties back into national security is obviously shipping security is a major issue. Anybody know how much percentage of overseas shipping China controls?
No, but I think you do. So
it's over 50.
Brian, we think that you know that answer.
It's over 50%, right? Now, where does that start? Obviously, you're going to be relying on them for certain things, but, they have ownership and control of both sides of the Panama Canal, right? What happens if one day they just decide to shut it down? Then what? Not only that, but I mean, obviously ZPMC cranes were in the news, right? Yeah. So modulated cranes that can be controlled remotely. The big concern was, are they collecting on them? Maybe, maybe not. The real question is, what happens if they just decide to shut them down?
Right, exactly.
Then what happens? So I think a lot of people have this idea that, national security is only focused on things that could cause kinetic damage or some type of catastrophic effect. Not necessarily the case. I mean, if I can topple, did the Soviet Union ever go down militarily? No, it went down due to economics. So I think that's a good lesson for us to look at is empires don't usually get conquered, certainly in the modern age. They go down due to economic competition, economic espionage, loss of innovation, and stagnation. That's what caused them to go down.
Yeah, if I could take this right back where we started.
No, that's fine.
Given all the things you just outlined, in terms of change in the strategic environment, if you were coming right back into the IC now, what kinds of skills would you need to have? And adding to that question, what kinds of things that are you doing to help prepare those who are junior in your environment or your organization for all this change?
Sure. So the hypothetical would be if you really wanted jobs in the IC right now, or at least what I see is going to be the emerging markets for the IC. AI technology is a big one. Informational warfare is the other huge one. Cyber is always going to have a home because cyber, I really do believe that the first attack on a modern nation is going to start with a DDoS attack, right? It's going to be a mass DDoS to try to knock out as much technological capabilities as possible before an invasion would go. We saw this all the way back with Georgia back in '07. The Russian invasion was preceded by a DDoS attack. So those three right there, cybersecurity, informational warfare, and AI, those are probably the three biggest emerging right now. The ones that are still going to, matter is good analysis, particularly the ability to do strategic analysis. Never going to go out of style. We need that for our policymakers. And when I say that is, the big thing with analysis is you're not writing the product for you, right? You're writing the product ideally so that a policymaker or decision maker can read the product, make sense of it, and decides, okay, what do I need to do? If they read your entire product and they look at you and go, I still don't know what to do, then you might have a problem. So that's the other thing is, so critical writing, those critical thinking skills. The other thing that I see, in academia when I teach at Georgetown is, human skills are never going to go out of style either. And when I say that is because, look, I fully acknowledge that we grow up in a world where social media is a much bigger part of everybody's lives. I desperately try to avoid it at all costs, but I understand that everybody's going to be into it. What that does is I think it hurts people's interpersonal communication skills at times. And I think if to really make yourself effective in the IC, if you really want to climb or you really want to do things, making sure you develop those skills so that not only can you articulate your points, but also can you have a conversation with somebody, explain your position, convince them why it matters, and be able to back it up. That's a huge boon for anybody who's trying to get a mission okayed or trying to get a funds greenlit, things like that. So not, on the pure tactical side, those three ints would be the huge things to focus on, but then those soft skills, as they call them, right? Those interpersonal communication, those critical analysis skills are always going to be something no matter what part of the IC you end up in. They're never going to go out of style. They're always good. Those are things that can be helpful if you're working human resources or if you're working security, right? All of them have a function and a place.
Yeah, and I guess I should ask this as part of my question is a three-part, but
Sure.
What kind of challenges are you, struggling with in your space, given all this change in the strategic environment?
So I think one of the things that the IC would do well to learn is that the younger you are, the better you have the ability to adapt in most cases, right? Older folks get stuck in their ways about what they focus on or what they do, things like that. So the ability to recruit or bring in kids, maybe not kids, but be younger folks who might have that mental lateral ability to learn new technologies faster. It's no secret that it's easier to learn tech when you're younger, right? As you grow up with something, you become much more accustomed to it. There's going to be tech that's going to develop in the next 10 years that I'm going to look at like it's alien just because I'm not growing up with it. I'm not going to understand it as much. It's the same thing as like, my parents had difficulty with a GPS because they would much rather read a map. It's the same idea. So one thing the IC would do really well is there needs to be better methods for people to get into the IC at a younger age at a reduced level of experience. And the big elephant in the room is the clearance process probably needs to be revamped, overhauled, certainly looked at. There needs to be faster methods for people to get in that don't involve signing a 4-year military contract, getting really lucky with an internship, or getting really lucky with a job right out of school. It's great when that happens. It's very rare. Meanwhile, we're sitting here with a whole bunch of GS7, GS9, and junior contractor positions that we can't fill because everybody qualified for them with the clearance doesn't want them because they're already priced out of the market. So if you wanted to, the other thing is when you bring kids in as GS7s, GS9s, junior contractors, you have the ability to mold them now. They don't learn bad analytical habits, hopefully. They don't learn bad habits when it comes to operations, things like that. You can actually teach them, mold them. You can invest in them, and hopefully they'll stay with your units. They'll stay. The other thing is, we see guys go military, they get a clearance, they work in maybe a field that would be beneficial to the IC, and they get out and they go work in the private sector because there's more money or there's better opportunities or it was faster. I've had guys go through the entire hiring process, get to the end, decide they didn't want the job because they've already been working at a private company for 3 months now.
Wow.
Because we're slow on the draw, because we've decided that we can't let anybody get anywhere close to our agency until they've gone through the entirety of the process. Okay, well, why don't we start? I was able to go to interrogator school in 2006 with an interim secret clearance. Why are we not, you had no problem exposing me to classified before my clearance had been completely finished. Exactly what is the problem with doing that? I'm not saying they shouldn't be monitored. They could certainly be under additional restrictions or scrutiny, but we need to find a way to get younger folks in here and renew that. I think the term that you used was we're looking at a potential critical human capital shortage of cleared personnel that want to work in the IC.
And to make that process a lot more efficient.
And stop making it so bloody scary. That's the other thing is, we make it sound like it's such a process where, we're part of this is, some of the processes we utilize, but we also need to embrace the technology that we have access to. Like, I know DoD has really made a push for trusted workforce and continuous monitoring. Yeah. I think, I can't say this for certain, but it feels like their ultimate goal is they want to get rid of periodic reinvestigations altogether unless they do them for cause, right? So you get to 6 years, everything's great, just roll you over. Great. Right. If something's happened, we'll check it out, whatever. Really, they should only be focusing on initial investigation, getting more people into the IC, and then ideally between reciprocation, trusted workforce, and continuous monitoring, the IC should hopefully kind of automate itself in that regard. Right. And I do think we are making those strides, but coinciding with those strides, we do need to create, and even if you created just a new program, or even if you create a situation where contractor companies for just junior contracting positions could sponsor kids for a clearance so that they could work on the contract while their clearance was processing, something like that. Not only would that be helpful for economic stimulation, but again, it would get guys in here working, get some experience, and it gets them to us early so we can start molding them into the guys who are going to replace me, replace you, and replace, they're going to replace us someday in that regard. And I want them to be as prepared as possible, because the world's not getting any less competitive, particularly now, because you're certainly looking at one rival who is geopolitically certainly a match for us in terms of capabilities, and will be a formidable figure for years to come. And you are also seeing the emergence of other countries who are starting to kind of assert their own, diplomatic thing. It's going to be a crowded field, and if we're not keeping ahead, we're going to have problems.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. Very, very thoughtful there.
Thank you again, Brian, for coming to the show.
My pleasure.
And just for our audience, what are the 2 or 3 key takeaways that they can take away from this episode?
I would say, going back to informational operation, is the smartest thing you can do as a person, whether you're in the IC or not, is be cognizant of the information sources you're getting them from. Investigate multiple sources, do your due diligence informationally. I think that will make just kind of a smarter electorate. It makes us smarter people, it makes a smarter society. And the other one is, if you have an interest in the IC, don't wait until you are finished with college to start looking at your options. Try to find your avenues early. Try to look for ways that you can get involved as soon as humanly possible. Trust me, there is a large IC workforce that wants you and needs you. We just need to find ways to get you there. But the sooner you guys get in our face and tell us, hey, I want to work for CBP, or I want to work for DIA, or I want to work for the CIA, the easier it is for us to hopefully get you on board and get you on that journey.
Okay.
Again, this was all my personal rambling, so don't think I'm too serious. But this is just kind of where I see kind of the IC going, as somebody who's now been in it for I got to do math. Sorry, 18 years. So yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen a lot of change, and as bleak as I may make it sound, it's still a very exciting time. It's going to be challenging, but it's also a great opportunity for people who want to make a difference in the world. There's a lot of real world things that need attention. So if you're thinking about getting into this business, enjoy it. It's a good, it's a great ride, and I can't. The IC's given me so much, and I couldn't have. I was planning to be a cop. I was planning to go law enforcement, and just didn't happen. I ended up in this field, and just want to talk
question is, a cop where?
I try to be
Which city?
I try to be U.S. Capitol Police, and got to like the final 5, and they were like, yeah, this is really cool that you got a degree and everything. There's like guys who have been in DC Metro for like 10 years. You have no chance. I was like, that sucks. 18 years later, I look at it and I'm like, wow, I fell into absolutely the right field. I could not imagine myself doing anything else. And I think for most people, if you really want to be in the IC, it will feel like a calling to you. And I think that's a sentiment I think many of us share.
Well,
Brian, thank you again for all the insights. Very
My pleasure.
intriguing conversation, so thank you. And we hope to see you back at the NatDEF podcast show.
I'd be more than happy to come back.
Wonderful.